don't know if any of you heard with all the misinformation being peddled by, well, almost every supposedly reputable outlet, but the United Nations is back in the news. Why? Oh, because their Human Rights Council, which the United States left in 2018, is now claiming that the US is a violator of human rights because of their persecution of the media's freedom of expression and our rampant racial discrimination. Which countries were leading the charge? Oh, how about Iran, China, Venezuela, Cuba, and Russia? Yeah, that's what they went with. But you know what? Much like the left, these countries like to go after people and countries when they are guilty of far worse themselves. So, screw them. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for another edition of Things That Need to Be Said. For MRC-TV, I'm Nick Kangadis. Let me just lead off with saying that when I say a country's name by itself in this video, I'm talking about their respective governments, not the people, unless otherwise noted. I'm only going to examine China, Iran, and Russia in this video because they're the biggest and most notable offenders. There was about 100 countries on this council, and I don't want you to have to watch me for hours, if not days. That's how many human rights violations these hypocrites are guilty of. Heck, I could do an entire hour, maybe 2 hours, on the abuses of China alone, but
ain't nobody got time for that.
Now, like I said at the top, these countries really don't have room to talk about human rights abuses when they themselves are some of the biggest violators of human rights. Even Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called out the UN and the countries involved.
In Geneva yesterday, the United States presented our national report on the U.S. commitment to domestic human rights at the UN Universal Periodic Review. I'm very proud of the work we did. Our remarkable, vibrant democracy provides for the greatest freedoms and protection of human rights anywhere in the world. The brutal regimes shouting the loudest about our record have the most to hide about their abysmal treatment of their own people.
Let's call China and the other countries out on their bullshit, shall we? To start us off, and I've been waiting for this one, China, you bastards. First and foremost, the entire world can thank China for this garbage. They've lied about it since the beginning, and the radical media doesn't even mention China anymore. Well, this is what I think of the new normal China released on all of us. That's just the tip of the iceberg for China too. How about the fact that they have literal concentration camps in their country because they want to eliminate an entire group of people from their population? I dislike the Chinese government so much that I'm going to show you the 2019 US State Department report on China's human rights practices. Quote, "There were numerous reports that the government or its agents committed arbitrary or unlawful killings. There were multiple reports authorities detained individuals and held them at undisclosed locations for extended periods. The government conducted mass arbitrary detention of Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Muslims in Xinjiang. China's human rights defenders reported these detentions amounted to enforced disappearance, since families were often not provided information about the length or location of the detention. Numerous former prisoners and detainees reported they were beaten, raped, subjected to electric shock, forced to sit on stools for hours on end, hung by the wrists, deprived of sleep, force-fed, forced to take medication against their will, and otherwise subjected to physical and psychological abuse. Although prison authorities abused ordinary prisoners, they reportedly singled out political and religious dissidents for particularly harsh treatment. Conditions in penal institutions for both political prisoners and criminal offenders were generally harsh and often life-threatening or degrading. Authorities considered information about prisons and various other types of administrative and extra-legal detention facilities to be a state secret, and the government typically did not permit independent monitoring. Lawyers, human rights activists, journalists, religious leaders, and adherents and former political prisoners and their family members continued to be targeted for arbitrary detention or arrest," unquote. All right, you get the idea? The report was so long that I've only shown you a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of China's human rights violations. Let's just say again, screw China. But this time let's add, screw the politicians, those in the radical media, giant corporations, and athletes in this country for covering up for them. On to Iran. Iran. Seriously? Do I even need to They yell death to America and death to Israel every chance they get. Sure, it's not a human rights violation to talk a little smack, but it shows the level of barbarian we're dealing with. Yeah, I said it. Oh, and did you see the picture of that terrorist Soleimani sitting behind the Iranian representative I showed you at the top? Yeah, go look. It's there. In the State Department's report on the human rights practices of Iran, quote, "The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, holds ultimate authority over all security agencies," unquote. I'll just give you a brief overview of these bureaucratic criminals. Now stay with me because this is quite the list of human rights abuses Iran has compiled. Quote, "Significant human rights issues included executions for crimes not meeting the international legal standard of most serious crimes, and without fair trials of individuals, including juvenile offenders. Numerous reports of unlawful or arbitrary killings, forced disappearance, and torture by government agents, as well as systematic use of arbitrary detention and imprisonment. Harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, hundreds of political prisoners, unlawful interference with privacy, significant problems with independence of the judiciary, particularly the revolutionary courts, severe restrictions on free expression, the press, and the internet, including violence, threats of violence, and unjustified arrests and prosecutions against journalists, censorship, site blocking, and criminalization of libel. Substantial interference with the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association, such as overly restrictive non-governmental organization laws, severe restrictions of religious freedom, restrictions on political participation through arbitrary candidate vetting, widespread corruption at all levels of government, unlawful recruitment of child soldiers by government actors to support the Assad regime in Syria, trafficking in persons, violence against ethnic minorities, harsh governmental restrictions on the rights of women and minorities, crimes involving violence or threats of violence targeting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons, criminalization of LGBTI status or conduct, and outlawing of independent trade unions." Unquote. Even with all that evil permeating in Iran's cultist government, the State Department noted that, quote, "Despite repeated calls from the international community, including the United Nations, the government effectively took no steps to investigate, prosecute, punish, or otherwise hold accountable officials who committed these abuses, many of which were perpetrated as a matter of government policy," unquote. Last but not least, let's briefly review Rachel Maddow's favorite country to talk about.
The Russian government scheme.
Here's the State Department's summary of Russia's human rights abuses. Quote, "Significant human rights issues included extrajudicial killings, including of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons in Chechnya by local government authorities, enforced disappearances, pervasive torture by government law enforcement personnel that sometimes resulted in death and occasionally involved sexual violence or punitive psychiatric incarceration, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prisons, arbitrary arrest and detention, political prisoners, severe arbitrary interference with privacy, severe suppression of freedom of expression and media, including the use of anti-extremism and other laws to prosecute peaceful dissent, violence against journalists, blocking and filtering of internet content and banning of online anonymity, severe suppression of the right of peaceful assembly, severe suppression of freedom of association, including overly restrictive laws on foreign agents and undesirable foreign organizations, severe restrictions of religious freedom, refoulement of refugees, severe limits on participation in the political process, including restrictions on opposition candidates' ability to seek public office and conduct political campaigns, and on the ability of civil society to monitor election processes, widespread corruption at all levels and in all branches branches of government, coerced abortion and sterilization, trafficking in persons, and crimes involving violence or threats of violence against persons with disabilities, LGBTI persons, and members of ethnic minorities, unquote. Folks, I'm just trying to be thorough, factual, and honest with all of you. If these countries want to play this game, well, we're Americans, and we play the game of life better than any other country in the history of the world, and it's not even close. At me. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The United Nations has far outlived its usefulness on any stage, let alone a world stage. We allow them to dwell on US soil, and they take every opportunity at their disposal to disparage a country that they could never have built themselves, no matter how many ivory towers they inhabit. What they don't understand is that despite all its faults, the US is still the greatest place in the history of planet Earth to live. But now, whether authoritarian countries or unelected global governments like it or not, it's up to us to keep it that way. Well, kiddies, did we all learn something? I know I did. Did you think this was something that needed to be said, or should we keep our heads in the sand? Let me know in the comments, where I do read most and respond to some. Oh, and dump Twitter. Follow me on Parler. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a share and a thumbs up. Those are the two best ways to let us know you want us to keep these videos coming. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so that YouTube might actually let you know when MRC-TV comes out with a new video if they haven't taken it down already. Like us on Facebook and check out more of our work on MRCTV.org. For MRC-TV, I'm Nick Kangadis.